For a long time, the story of David and Goliath has been treated as an isolated event, a young shepherd facing a giant and winning against all odds. And indeed, Goliath was one of the greatest challenges ever described in the Bible. His height, his strength, the weight of his armor, and the way he intimidated entire armies made him seem almost impossible to confront. But there is one detail that completely changes how this story should be understood. Goliath was not unique. He was not an exception. He was part of a lineage. The Bible itself reveals that Goliath was only one among several giants who existed at that time. He did not appear out of nowhere, and his fall did not mark the end of this threat. On the contrary, after Goliath was defeated, other giants were still alive, still fighting, still posing a real danger. This completely changes the picture, because it means the Valley of Elah was not the end of a story. It was only the beginning of something much larger. And as we continue reading the biblical accounts, we find something that is almost never mentioned. Other giants appear, other names emerge, and they all share the same characteristics: extraordinary strength, unusual physical structure, and a dominant presence on the battlefield. But more than that, they are all connected. They belong to the same origin. The biblical text makes it clear that these giants were descendants of an ancient people known as the Rephaim, a lineage that existed long before David, long before Israel entered the Promised Land. These giants were not just large. They were known for their strength, their endurance, and their overwhelming presence across multiple regions. And when Goliath appears, he does not represent the beginning of something new. He represents the continuation of something ancient. This explains why, even after his death, the war continues. Because the problem was never just one individual, it was an entire lineage that still existed. And this is exactly where the story begins to shift direction. Because after Goliath's fall, the Bible begins to record confrontations that are often overlooked. Battles where other giants enter the scene. Some face David's men directly, others appear in strategic moments, and they all have one thing in common: they are not random. They are part of the same sequence. This reveals something important. David did not only defeat a single giant, he opened the path for a war that still needed to be completed, and that war would not be fought by him alone. It would continue through his men. From this point on, the focus shifts. The story is no longer about a single confrontation, but about a series of battles against different giants. And within these battles, we find details that make everything even more intriguing. Because these giants did not just exist, they were organized. They appeared at the right moments, and in some cases, they carried traits that go beyond what would be considered normal for a human being. And that is exactly where the story stops being merely impressive and starts becoming unsettling. Because when one giant was enough to paralyze an entire army, the question now becomes something else entirely. What happens when there are several? After the story moves beyond the Valley of Elah, the entire scene changes. What once seemed like an isolated confrontation begins to reveal itself as a sequence of battles against the same ongoing threat. And it is at this point that one of the most surprising and little-known moments in the entire narrative appears. A new giant enters the scene. His name was Ishbi-Benob. Unlike Goliath, he does not appear to publicly challenge an entire army. He emerges in the middle of war at a strategic moment, and more than that, he appears when David is no longer the young man he once was. Time has passed. Battles have accumulated. The body begins to feel the weight of years. And it is exactly in this context that the confrontation takes place. The biblical text makes it clear that Ishbi-Benob was not an ordinary warrior. He, too, carried heavy weaponry similar to the other giants. His presence was not only physical, it was threatening. He does not enter the battle by accident. He enters with a direct objective: to kill David. And for the first time, the situation does not unfold as before. David does not dominate the confrontation. He does not surprise the enemy with an advantage. He begins to lose strength. He grows tired. His pace is no longer the same. The one who once faced a giant alone is now at a disadvantage against another. This detail completely changes how the story is perceived, because it shows that the war against the giants was not symbolic. It was not something resolved in a single moment of faith or courage. It was a real sequence of dangerous encounters where even David himself could be defeated, and it is exactly at this moment that something decisive happens. Abishai, one of David's most loyal warriors, recognizes the danger. He enters the battle at the right moment, fights the giant, and kills him. He does not merely assist, he prevents the story from ending there. This moment reveals something very important. The fight against the giants was no longer individual, it had become collective. David was no longer alone in this war. His men now participated directly in these confrontations, and this is not accidental. There is an implicit recognition here. The threat has not yet been eliminated. It is still alive. After this episode, David's own men make a decision that shows the weight of the situation. They tell him that he should no longer go into battle, not out of weakness, but because he was too important to take such risks again. They understand something beyond the battlefield. David was not just a king, he needed to remain alive. And this completely changes the dynamics of the coming battles. From this point on, other warriors begin to face the giants, other names start to appear, other battles are recorded, and each one reinforces the same idea. The war is not over yet, because Ishbi-Benob was not the last one. He was only another one. And this raises an unavoidable question. If more giants were still appearing, how many were there still? After the confrontation with Ishbi-Benob, something becomes increasingly clear. The threat of the giants was not isolated, it was continuous. And what is most interesting is that the next confrontations no longer involve David directly, but rather his men. This shows a clear shift in the scenario. The war did not end. It simply changed hands. And it is at this point that another name appears. A giant who, at first glance, might seem like just another enemy among many. But when the text is observed closely, it becomes clear that he is not ordinary. He is part of the same sequence. He carries the same characteristics. And more importantly, he is connected to the same origin. This giant is mentioned as someone defeated in battle by one of David's warriors. What draws attention is not only his presence, but the fact that he appears within a pattern that begins to repeat itself. The confrontations are not isolated. They occur in sequence, always involving giants connected to one another. This indicates organization, not only in a military sense, but in the sense of continuity. These giants were not disappearing over time. They kept emerging, and this reinforces something that has been building from the very beginning. There is an active lineage, a common origin that continues to produce individuals with the same characteristics. And then another detail becomes even more interesting. One of these giants is described as wielding a weapon very similar to that of another who had already been defeated. The Bible makes a point of highlighting this, a spear with a shaft, like a weaver's beam. This is not just a technical description, it is a signature. It shows that these were not simply large warriors. There was a pattern, a style, a repetition of characteristics that directly links these giants together, and this further strengthens the idea of a lineage. Because when patterns repeat, when traits consistently appear across different individuals, it points to something inherited, something that did not arise by chance. But what truly makes this sequence even more striking is the way these giants are defeated. Not by David, but by his men. That is significant. Because it shows that what began with David now spreads outward. Other warriors take on the responsibility. Others enter the confrontation. And this indicates that the war against this lineage did not depend on one man alone. It needed to be completed, and each battle represents a step in that process. But even so, there is something that makes this story even more unsettling, because among all these giants, one of them stands out in a different way, not only because of size, but because of a characteristic that goes beyond strength, something that does not fit within the normal human pattern. And when this detail appears, the story stops being just about giants and begins to reveal something even stranger about the origin of this lineage. Among all the giants mentioned in the accounts of these battles, there is one who stands out in a different way, not only because of his size, not only because of his strength, but because of a detail that immediately draws attention. The Bible describes this giant with an unusual characteristic. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 fingers in total. This is not a common detail in ancient texts. It is not something included by chance. The narrative itself makes a point of recording it directly, and this raises an important question. Why highlight such a specific characteristic? Because it reveals something. In modern genetics, the presence of extra fingers is known as polydactyly. In isolated cases, it can occur as a rare variation, but when this trait appears in a complete, symmetrical form within the same lineage, it stops being a random anomaly. It becomes inheritance. This means this giant was not simply different. He carried a genetic mark, a signature pointing to something passed down through generations. And when we connect this with the other giants already mentioned, the pattern becomes even clearer. Extraordinary strength, unusual physical structure, a dominant presence in battle, and now a specific genetic trait repeating within the same line. This no longer seems random. This looks like a defined lineage. This giant does not appear alone. He emerges as part of a sequence of confrontations involving individuals with the same origins. And this reinforces an important idea. These giants were not isolated warriors. They were descendants of something greater, something still active. And what is most interesting is the way this giant behaves. The biblical text describes him challenging Israel, just as other giants had done before. There is a behavioral pattern, provocation, intimidation, and direct confrontation. This shows that it was not only about physical strength. There was a repeated posture, a consistent way of engaging in battle, and once again he is defeated, not by David, but by one of his warriors. This repeats throughout the accounts. Every giant that appears is eventually confronted by someone from the same alliance. This shows that the war against this lineage did not depend on a single man. It was being carried out continuously until they were all eliminated. But the most important detail is not just the defeat. It is the pattern that becomes undeniable. These giants do not disappear naturally. They must be confronted, one by one. This indicates that the root of what produced them still existed, and as long as that root remained, more could still emerge. And that is exactly why this story cannot be seen as just a sequence of battles. It is, in reality, the record of a process of eliminating a lineage that did not fit within the natural order. But this still does not answer the most important question. If all these giants belong to the same origin, where exactly did this lineage come from? If all these giants share such specific patterns, then the origin of this lineage cannot be recent. It must be far older than the battles recorded in the time of David. And that is exactly what begins to emerge when we look at the accounts that take place before Israel entered the Promised Land. The spies sent by Moses had already encountered these giants. They described the descendants of Anak as men of such great stature that they saw themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. This is not just an expression of fear. It is the reaction of those standing before something that does not fit within the normal human pattern. These peoples were not isolated. They occupied specific regions. They were organized. And more importantly, they were recognized by the same defining characteristic: extraordinary size and strength. The Bible mentions groups such as the Anakim and the Rephaim, always associated with this dominant presence. This shows that the lineage of the giants did not begin in the wars of David. It already existed long before, spread across different regions. And this raises an unavoidable question. If these giants were already there before Israel arrived, then where did they come from? Because every lineage has an origin. And when we go even further back in time, we find references suggesting that these giants did not simply arise through natural growth. They are described as descendants of ancient peoples who already carried these traits from earlier generations. This creates a continuous line, a sequence that stretches across history. But there is something even more intriguing. These giants always appear in the same contexts: conflict, domination, direct opposition to the people of God. This does not seem random, it seems directed, as if this lineage was positioned exactly at the points where history becomes most decisive. And that is why, when Israel enters the Promised Land, these peoples are not treated as ordinary enemies. In some cases, the command is different. It is not simply to conquer, but to completely eliminate. This has always raised questions. Why such severity? Why not absorb these peoples as was done with others? But when we understand that this lineage carried something outside the normal pattern, something that repeated across generations, the picture changes completely. It was not just about territory, it was about preventing the continuation of something. And this explains why, even after multiple defeats, giants continued to appear. Because their origin had not yet been fully eliminated. Each recorded battle was not just a military victory, it was a step within a larger process, a process of interruption. And this leads us to an important understanding. The giants were not just large, they were the result of something that began long before. Something that left marks throughout history, and that, even after many generations, was still present. But there is still one detail that makes all of this even more powerful. Because throughout these battles, not only are the giants defeated, the lineage itself begins to disappear. And this raises a final question before the conclusion. What happened to this lineage after all these wars? After all these battles, something begins to happen in a clear way, even though the Bible never states it in a single direct sentence. The lineage of the giants begins to disappear. Not naturally, not through the passage of time, but through continuous confrontations. One by one, these giants are defeated. Not all at once, not in a single decisive war, but across multiple recorded episodes. And this detail is important, because it shows this was not a simple problem. It was something that had to be dealt with progressively. Each defeated giant represented more than a military victory. It represented the removal of an element within a lineage that had been passing through generations. And when we look at the full set of accounts, we notice a pattern. There is no mention of new giants emerging after these final confrontations. There is no continuation of this lineage in later texts. This suggests that at some point this sequence was interrupted, and not by chance. David's men play a central role in this process. Each one of them faces one of these giants. Each one contributes to the end of this lineage. This shows that responsibility was not concentrated in a single person. It was a mission shared among many, and this reinforces an important idea. The threat was not symbolic. It was real, concrete, and had to be completely eliminated. At the same time, the absence of new records after these events shows that this objective was achieved. The lineage does not continue to appear, it does not spread, it does not reorganize itself, it simply ceases to exist in the biblical accounts. And this changes how we understand the entire story, because the focus shifts from individual battles to the final outcome. a lineage that existed even before Israel entered the Promised Land, was gradually eliminated. But this disappearance raises an interesting question. If these giants represented something outside the normal human pattern, something that carried different characteristics, then the end of this lineage was not just the end of a group of warriors. It was the end of something that was not meant to continue. And this gives even more weight to each of these battles, because they were not just historical records, they were part of a larger process, a process of correction, of restoring order. And this explains why these giants always appear in contexts of direct conflict, and why, after a certain point, they simply stop being mentioned. Their story does not end with a great announcement. It ends in silence, and that silence says a lot, because it indicates that what needed to be done was done. And when we look at the whole picture, from the emergence of these giants to the moment they stop appearing, we realize something important. This was never just a story about strength, size, or war. It was the story of a lineage that existed and had to be brought to an end. And now, looking at all of this, one final question remains. If this lineage disappeared from history, why do we still talk about it today? After all these battles and the gradual disappearance of giants from the biblical narratives, a question continues to echo to this day. If this lineage truly existed, if these giants were real, then how did it all begin? Because the Bible shows the end of this sequence, it shows the confrontations, it shows the elimination, but it does not go into all the details about the origin. And it is exactly at this point that many scholars over the years have begun to look at other ancient texts that circulated in the same period. One of the most well-known is the so-called Book of Enoch. This book is not part of the traditional biblical canon. In other words, it is not considered official scripture by most traditions. However, it is still an ancient document, highly regarded in historical contexts, and it was known to early communities that also preserved biblical writings. And what draws attention in it is that it presents a detailed narrative about the origin of the giants. According to this text, certain spiritual beings would have descended to earth, interacted with human women, and produced a hybrid lineage. These descendants would be the giants. The book describes these beings as extremely strong, dominant, and responsible for spreading corruption and violence across the earth. This description, although not part of the official Bible, presents an explanation that many consider an echo of ancient traditions connected to what we see in Genesis 6. And it is precisely here that the connection becomes interesting, because the Bible, in Genesis, briefly mentions the sons of God and the giants, but in a very condensed way. The Book of Enoch, on the other hand, expands this narrative, going into detail. It does not create something entirely disconnected, but rather deepens a theme that already appears in summary form in the biblical text. This does not mean both texts should be placed on the same level, but it does mean that there is an ancient tradition attempting to explain something that was already known. And when we look at the giants faced by David's men, this possibility starts to carry more weight, because they do not seem to arise in a normal way. They do not follow the typical human pattern. They appear as part of something larger, something that had already been developing long before. And this explains why, even without all the explicit details in the Bible, the idea of a different lineage has always been present. But there is a very important point here. Regardless of how this lineage began, the Bible makes it clear how it ends. It is interrupted. It is eliminated. It does not continue. And this shows that the focus of Scripture was never to satisfy curiosity about origins in full detail, but to show that what is not aligned with God's established order would not remain. And this leads us to an important reflection, because even though these giants no longer exist today, the impact they had on history is still remembered. And perhaps it is not only because of curiosity about their size or strength, but because of what they represented: a distortion, a rupture, something that was not meant to continue. And that is exactly what makes this story remain relevant to this day. Because it is not only about the past, it raises a question that still echoes in the present. If something is not aligned with God's order, how long can it truly remain? Even after understanding the origin, the confrontations, and the disappearance of the giants, there is still a point that must be carefully considered. Because these accounts are not just ancient records of unusual battles, they follow a pattern. And when something repeats within the scriptures, it usually reveals something greater than what appears at first glance. The giants do not appear at random moments. They emerge during strategic periods, always close to critical decisions, always connected to moments of advancement or transition, always positioned as obstacles before the people of God. This does not seem random. It seems intentional, as if this lineage was present exactly where it could have the greatest impact. And this is not limited to physical strength. The psychological effect of these giants was just as powerful. When the spies saw the descendants of Anak, their reaction was not just fear. It was paralysis. They said they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This shows that the impact went beyond size. It affected perception, confidence, and the ability to respond. Fear spread before the battle even began. And this reveals something important. Not every war begins with an attack. Some begin with intimidation, with doubt, with the feeling that there is no point in trying. And this pattern is still extremely relevant today, because even without physical giants today, the same effect still exists. Situations that seem larger than they should be, problems that, even before being faced, already create surrender. Scenarios where perception becomes bigger than reality. And this connects directly to what we see in these accounts. The giants were not only large, they made others feel small. And that was part of the battle. But there is another, even more important detail. All of these giants were defeated. None of them remained. Regardless of their strength, size, or the impact they caused, all of them were eventually eliminated over time. And this shows something that is often overlooked. The size of the threat does not define the final outcome. And this completely changes how we see these stories, because the focus shifts away from the giant and toward who remains, who confronts, who does not retreat. And this is exactly what separates the moments when fear dominates from the moments when history changes. The spies retreated, David advanced, David's men continued, and in the end, the lineage disappeared. This did not happen by chance. It happened because someone chose not to stop. And perhaps that is exactly the point that connects all of this to the present, because the story of the giants was not recorded just to show that they existed. It was recorded to show what happens when something seems too big to be faced, and is still faced anyway. But there is still one final question that must be answered. If all these giants were defeated, what truly remains of this story? After everything we've seen, one thing becomes clear. The story of the giants is not just about size, strength, or ancient battles. It is about something deeper, something that crosses generations and still makes sense today. Because in the end, what remained from this story were not the giants. They disappeared. They were defeated. They were eliminated over time. What remained was the record of how they were faced, and that changes the focus completely. Because the question was never just, who were the giants? The question was always, how were they defeated? And the answer is not found in physical strength, not in size, not in advantage. It is found in posture, in the decision not to retreat, in the ability to look at something bigger than yourself and still move forward. The giants created fear even before any confrontation. They dominated the scene, shaped perception, and paralyzed those who looked at them. But they all had one thing in common. They fell, one by one, not because they were weak, but because they were not invincible. And that is the most important point of the entire story. What seemed impossible was defeated. What seemed uncontrollable was brought down. What seemed permanent disappeared. And that leaves a clear message. Not everything that looks big lasts. Not everything that intimidates dominates. Not everything that scares wins. But there is something even stronger here. Because the giants were not just physical obstacles, they represented opposition, pressure, direct challenge, and even so, they did not endure. This shows that the size of the struggle does not define the final outcome. What defines it is who remains standing. And perhaps that is exactly why this story is still told today. Not because of the giants, but because of those who faced them. Because in the end, no one remembers their height, but everyone remembers who did not retreat.